Hey everyone, welcome to the DMP challenge from the Map Painting for Filmmakers project. Today we are looking at a still frame from a VFX Horde sequence. So the sequence is the Alleyway sequence. The way we're going to be doing this is like a daily session. So I'm going to be critiquing everybody's work individually and giving them specific comments as if we were in a daily session at a VFX studio. This will give you a preview of what it will be like if you pledge your support to get access to all the sequences and you're admitted to the VFX Horde Daily Sessions group that will be held twice a month, where I'll be taking a look at everybody's work, but instead of looking at still frames, we're going to be looking at the full image sequences for all these different sequences. Just a reminder that you need to make your pledge before May 12th so you can get early access to these sequences. If you don't, then you'll have to wait till these sequences are 100% complete and they're made available to the public later this year. Before we jump into this daily session, I just wanted to quickly go over a little bit of the technical setup for the EXR footage that we have. So we have one single frame. It's not an image. It's a single frame of an image sequence, and it's an EXR. So that means it's 32-bit, and you can tell that right up here at the top. It'll say 32-bit, and it's an EXR. So what you need to do to bring this into a different color space, because you don't want to be working in 32-bit, especially for this DMP challenge, you probably just work in 8-bit, which would be just fine. So if you go over here and change it to 8-bit, it's going to ask you, it's going to bring up this dialog box, and immediately it's going to flash this image. So you don't want it to change your image when you go from 32-bit to 8-bit. You want it to stay the same color range and values and colors and everything. So what you do is you go up here to method and you go just to gamma, exposure and gamma, and these are set at the default values of 0 and 1, and that will bring it back down to where it was before you started. So if you click OK, then now we are in 8-bit, and we have a normal image here. So we've gone from 32-bit to 8-bit, and we haven't changed any of the values here, so it appears the same. So let's quickly go over the shot brief that is listed on the VFX Horde website. So in that shot brief, it talks about a doorway being added right here, and with some steps, garbage up and down, and using muck and stuff and grime up on the windows, or excuse me, up on the walls and the ground, some garbage here and there, and a light source in this window right there. So that is the shot brief. So let's go ahead and take a look at Alberto's work. So this is Alberto's work. So you can see this is the original plate, and this is Alberto's work. Initially, I can see that when you brought in your footage, that it did a really drastic, color correction on it when you changed it from 32-bit to 8-bit, which we have here. So overall, we have this really flashed look. So if we put on, I'm just going to put a color correction curve on it just to kind of bring a little bit down where we would kind of expect it to be right there. So first off, I can see that there's a lot of things going on. This door has been replaced. There's garbage in the alleyway. I can see here that this has been completely replaced. It doesn't follow the notes, but I'll address the issues anyways. I think that the resolution of this object, or excuse me, this doorway right here is not high enough resolution. It looks a little more fuzzy than it does with the plate around it. So typically when you're working in matte painting, you should work double resolution. So you take this plate, double res it, or at least 1.5 res it, and then all of the elements that you bring into it, matte painting elements, should be that higher resolution. So if you bring it in right away, it's not the right resolution, then you can be like, okay, that's not going to work. That photo reference isn't going to work. So especially through like here, these little areas and stuff, I can tell that it's lower resolution. There are things that you can do to make things appear to be higher resolution, which would require you to do like little specks and hits and glints and a kind of a paint over. The danger that you have there is that as soon as you're doing really drastic paint overs on it, it starts to look painterly, and that's a bad thing. So so I don't think that this element works because of the resolution issue. Also, so let's talk about this doorway here. So on this doorway, you just have to make sure that your perspective is really spot on. And I think overall, I think it is, but I feel like it droops just a little bit. So like it kind of droops here, and I think it kind of droops there, like it goes down on this side, down on this side, where it should be a little more straight like this on all of these angles. It has a little bit of a slant this way, if that makes sense. So where all these, and I think you can see it here. You see this angle right here and this angle right here. This one kind of tucks in right there, and then this one is straight. So I think just a little bit of tweaking on this doorway would help out a lot. Also, steps. Anytime you're like, positioning something like this into a new spot, then you have to deal with the steps, because you can get a lot of these other angles just by manipulating the image to be in the right perspective, but most likely you're not going to get the steps to work. So you would have to cut out sections of this and reposition them so that they're working. So like this here looks like it's drooping a lot, and we can see on top of this step quite a bit, which makes it appear as if it is that it's kind of goopy, that the perspective is off, and so there's something structurally wrong with it. So it looks a little bit wrong. If you look at this step right here, you see how little of that top surface that we see, and I know that it's farther away, but just the distance between this and this wouldn't justify seeing so much on top of that. So you would have to cut up this thing so that you would see less of it. So mapping out and hitting that perspective, I think, would help out a lot. Also, in terms of graphic images, it's cool that there's graffiti on the wall. However, if you're working on a film and you're putting any kind of, commercial iconic things on there, then the studio could actually get sued. So this is great. Fantastic to have, that kind of graffiti. But this kind of graffiti right here, where we have the Simpsons here, it's not gonna fly. So that addresses that. Also, the garbage here. So overall, I just want to make a comment on the value, some of your values. So if I took, let's say I've got an exposure node here, so I'm gonna brighten it up. I'm going to expose up, and then this is going to show, this is a little test to show us where all the darkest areas are. So initially it's a bit hard because you brought in the plate and that really whacked out the colors, but we can see here that the things that you added, like these little, all of these guys here, are some of the darkest things on the plate. And so overall, I think that the values of your garbage piles are too dark, if that makes sense. They're too black. So black areas like in here and in here and here and here and here. So I think all of those need to go through and be lifted to make sure they're not black. As far as integration goes, so you've got two things. You have lighting direction and integration. And I know on this plate, it's really quite subtle, the lighting direction. But if you look at this window right here, you can see that there's dark underneath here. And you can see that there's some lighting direction right here. You can see how the shadow from this is kind of going onto that windowsill. And so in the plate, that will give you some visual cues of the lighting direction. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to simulate that in your elements down here. So I, like on some of these, I can see I think this is great back here. I think that's working. I think when we get into like this here, where this is really dark, it'd be nice to have some kind of indication of a lighting direction, as subtle as that is, on all of these elements here. So like, like if there was some shadowing, self-shadowing on this box or something like that, then that would be great. I think a big thing that's missing as far as the integration of these elements is the shadows. So if you look on the ground for the shadows, we're not really seeing any kind of shadow shapes. So we would have two kinds of shadows on these. We'd have like this ambient occlusion kind of shadow, and that's just when objects get close to each other, they kind of create a little shadow shape. And then if you and then there should be a directional light shadow for that. So those are the two shadows that we should see. And I'm not seeing it in here, and I think it will make all of your elements feel much, much nicer to have those kinds of shadowings on there. So we've talked about the shadows, the lighting direction, and then you would go through and balance your values, right? I talked about that. So this is kind of a really dark shape, dark shape, dark shape. And like that, I think that's working more or less there. Maybe that's just a little bit dark in there. But overall, yeah, I think that's what you would need to do. I would expect that this to be pretty dark right there. Also, you want to make sure that you have the correct scale. So you see this trash bag here, if it's that size, and then a person is going to be walking out of here. They're going to be this tall approximately. And so I'm expecting like a big trash bag or something to be much, much bigger than that. And so I think the scale on of it needs to be increased, especially around the doorway. So the doorway gives our visual cue of the size of what things should be. And I think overall, I think it's a bit small. So so if you increase the scale on these, then I think that will look a lot better. And then the wires here. So there's an integration issue with how dark these values are. You can see how dark those are. Also, I think you can take another pass at extracting these wires from the original source, because they look a little bit soft here and there. And so you'll want to go through, and especially with something like that, it has to be quite detailed. It'll probably take a long time to start cutting these things out. So go ahead, cut all those out, and then they need shadows too. So if this is sitting right against this surface right here, then it needs to have a little bits of shadows, occlusion shapes. Right now, it feels like it's setting apart from the surface, like it's sitting above it. So there's no visual cues to say that it's actually, sitting, back on and is attached to that surface. I think there's a little bit of a perspective issue here too, with this thing. That I think that gives it away. So, and then this right here, because really, if we're looking down on it, then it should be round like this and not up like that. Yeah. So, and then this looks a little bit fuzzy as far as like it integrating into anything down here. So I think that's it. It's overall a good image, and I think it's a good step. I think if you revisit the values, the colors, the lighting direction, the perspective, and just make sure those are really spot on, then that will greatly enhance the image. And you'll probably want to go back and just import that image correctly. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at Anna's. And so I'm going to flip that on and off. So I can see that there's a bunch of changes here, and let's just go through those. I can see that you've added a door here. That wasn't part of the original notes, but it's actually a pretty cool door. I think it's really nice the way that that's done and integrated. It's a really the paint is flicking on it. It's pretty cool. So I would say that that's great. There are points where, especially on some of these objects, where there's a shadow underneath like that. And so that looks like that object is hovering in the air. And I think that goes with all of these. I think if you have an object right here, then if you put a shadow down here, then you're saying that this object is floating above the surface about that much. But if you go and you make the shadow really tightly close on that object, then it becomes a contact shadow. So if it's a contact shadow, then it feels like it's hitting the surface. And then in addition to that contact shadow, you have maybe just a little bit of shadowing out here, which is kind of your occlusion or your directional light shadow. So if the light is kind of coming into the alley this way, then you'd have a shadow coming out this side to kind of slightly indicate that there's a light source. So, and I see that problem with all of your objects here. They all seem like they're floating off the ground, but you're using adjustment layers, so that will be easily fixed. Also, I see like there's been a hazing kind of going on, you have a really wide brush and you're brushing it across the surface of this, and it's giving it a softness. And the problem with that is that it's going over your matte painting elements, which actually is fine, but it's also going over the plate. So you have to think about this, if you're going to be transferring this to a plate, then the actual composite happens in Nuke. So you have to export your layers, and it has to fit on top of the comp in Nuke. So in order for you to do that, you have to be able to export everything on a layer. So that would include the shadows and stuff. And the way that you would do that with the shadows is that you would include a little bit of the plate, actually, where your shadow is. And so if you have a shadow coming out here, that would be included in your layer. And so all of these would have to be exported as layers to be comped in into the plate. So the problem is when you have a big fuzzy shape, and let's say in Photoshop, your fuzzy shape kind of goes like this, okay? Because it's going across a bunch of things. That fuzzy shape can't easily be exported from Photoshop into Nuke, nor should it be exported from Photoshop to Nuke. So what you're doing here is you're really changing the plate, which as a matte painter, you're making your additions. You have your area that you're working on, but you can't manipulate the whole plate within Photoshop because that can't be reproduced in Nuke across the whole image sequence. Okay, so if it were, then they would, then this would have to be a completely CG shot, and they would be replacing everything with your work, which would be quite drastic for the notes that are required for this. So I hope that makes sense. So you want to really make sure that you can get all of your objects out separately. And the way, like in Photoshop, it should be that you have your plate down here at the bottom, and then you have little folders of your different layers, and then these should be turned on and off, and so and then these are exported separately. If that makes sense. And so this stays exactly the same. There's no color corrections overall to the plate that you're making. That should be done in Nuke. And then these three, these layers would be exported separately if required. They'd be either all together or separately, and you would put those into Nuke. Those would go right into Nuke as matte painted elements to be added on top of the plate. And then the compositor takes your elements and puts film grain on it and all that kind of stuff to make it integrate in. So so if you're making big, wide color corrections, you can't do that in Photoshop. and you can't do really wide, like big, floating shape things that are going across multiple elements like that, because that can't be easily exported out of Photoshop. I mean, let's say you had a little mist element or something here, then you could export that mist element maybe separately, but it would have to be an isolated element. But where you have it, changing a lot of the image, like I said, that would be too difficult. Okay, so it looks like your the replacement that you have here is looking good, and it is just a little bit fuzzy on all of these edges. So I would just make sure that you have a bit of sharpness to that, and make sure. And actually, I said that about the perspective, but I guess I'm seeing just a little bit of where it's just a little bit off. So I would just go back and revisit that a little bit. You do have visual cues in the plate because you have these brick, and that kind of gives you an idea of the perspective on that. So like you can see the line that I'm making here, that's following this brick to this brick, and then your mullions here, these little spaces in between the glass panes are called mullions. And you can see that yours is just a little bit off from that. And so you want to just make sure, do a grid on here, and then just make sure that your elements are lining up with that grid. Overall, I would say that's it. I think it would be vastly improved with the little contact shadows there, little directional light. So maybe hitting some of these with a little bit of an adjustment layer so that there's a light side and a dark side on all of these elements, and then the directional shadow, and then turning off all of the soft fuzzy things that you have going on here. So let's say, for instance, like in this area here, you're indicating that maybe there's a light, coming down from this window. That's not really justified with the setup that you have here. You'd have to have something a bit warmer, I think, or a bit hotter here to justify this. But let's say you did have something here, a stronger light here, and it was shining down on this, then the light that you add, you can export that into Nuke as a mask and make that color correction in Nuke, or you can cut a section out of the plate. So your replacement is this doorway right here, is this complete thing, and it includes part of the plate down here because that's where you're putting your light direction out there. So that's a couple of different ways of doing it. But yeah, so I think that's a good image. I think with just a little bit of work, it will dramatically increase the quality of the image. Okay, now we're looking at Arkie's image. So if we flip that on and off here, we can see that there's just a little bit of a shift of the plate, which I'm putting down to just having this image on Facebook and pulling it off. So, but if you did see this shift in your work, then that would be a problem. So let's go ahead and make some notes. The coloration of the plate is good. It's working. I think probably this is going to be problematic, how dark this is. And part of it has to do with how dark the plate is. But let's just quickly do an exposure on that. And that would be the test to see. And we do, actually, there is information back there, which is great. So if it was like a black hole, then that would be problematic. But as we can see, it's not, because we lift the values and we can actually see stuff back there. It is a little problematic with the perspective here, because it kind of does this thing. So that perspective is off on these lines, and maybe you'd say, oh, well, it's too dark, they're not even going to see it. But, you know, inevitably, like, you have to build some integrity into your image. If you don't, and when I say integrity, that means like things that are dark and you lift the values, those have to be good images too. And they all have to be working together when you lift it and when you crush it and all this kind of stuff that you do to the image. Because after you're done with it, it's going to go to a colorist, and most likely he's going to adjust it in a way that's going to show all of the problems with the matte painting. So that's why you always want to be able to do these checks of turning on and off this exposure just to make sure that everything is working correctly. Okay, so but you know, saying that, I think that there's probably some things, you know, maybe this light we're on, or maybe something, maybe we're just getting a little bit of like a window and some light coming out of the window or something to fill this space. And maybe it's that this is like a dark green color, and so it gets really dark. And so maybe having a different type of doorway there that wasn't so black. Because overall, I mean, the note on the shot was to replace this with a doorway. So yes, you have hit the note. There is a doorway there, but it is a black hole. And now the client's like, yeah, I asked for that to be filled, but I can't really see anything now. So if you get that note, you have to look behind what the note represents. They're wanting a door to be put there so that can add visual interest to the shot. And right now, I did add a door, but it is kind of a big black hole, and so I should look for an alternative for something in this space that would be a little, you know, would be brighter, would have more appeal to it. Also, so that there were talks about that. So let's talk about these garbage piles. Out here, I think this is looking, I think, really good. I'm seeing little contact shadows and things like that. And I'm seeing just a little bit of indication of light on these elements, which is good. I think this trash can would probably have just a little bit slightly darker side on that. And so I think this is working pretty well. I think the scale of this might be off. So if we're saying a human is maybe this tall here, that would be human scale. Then, and if you were to take that down, then this trash can would be like mid-height, like they could rest their arm on it. And that, I think, makes for a pretty small dumpster. So I think that dumpster would have to be, I think, probably this scale up here. So probably increase it 25% of that scale or more to be the appropriate scale for this shot. I think what it does is it kind of miniaturizes the shot and exaggerates the distance. Because visually we have an idea of the scale, but when we see objects that are smaller, it exaggerates the distance from here to here because this is small. So you'll probably, you know, you'll want to make sure. But the problem is that if you scale this up really big, then it's blocking all the really cool visual interest that we have here, where we're just seeing a sliver of that back alleyway. So either this guy gets moved this way, but if he gets moved this way, then he's in front of this doorway. And so I would say X him. So not a really good solution, because if you did fix the scale, then it wouldn't look pleasing anymore. So I would say get rid of this guy. We could do without him. And but this is looking good. Darker here. This area right here, I think, needs a little bit of work. Like, I think there should be some indication of shadows. If you see that this is a dark side, this is a dark side, and this is the light side, then it feels like the light is coming from this direction. So, but we know that the light is coming from this direction because it's coming in between these two buildings. So I think the lighting is off on this. That could be fixed with adjustment layers. You just go through and fix those. I'm not really wild about this garbage can. I think it's a bit isolated. You can see the whole shape, and it's a bit like a cutout. And so I think what would improve that a lot is to have more garbage in front of it, like you do here. But then also, I don't think the perspective is quite right, so it looks a little bit strange on that. So anytime you're like fighting with an element for a long period of time, like you're just like, I want a trash can in there, but it's just not working for you, then it's better just to chuck the element and try something else, right? You have some latitude about what you put in this alleyway. And so, just, you can try new elements. If they don't work, you just chuck them and just try new stuff. And so I think this guy here would be a good person just to throw away, try something new in that spot. Maybe some larger trash cans or trash bags or something like that would be interesting up through here. Would be nice. And that kind of like leads your eye down that way, because having this trash up here kind of like blocks the eye and leads you down there. So that might be good. So let's talk about this window right here and seeing through. I think for one, this is a really crystal clear window. And I know you have just a little bit of muck on there, but I think overall it would help it if we had some kind of obscuring of the background. So this is like a dark alleyway, and this looks like a nice like interior. And so for them to have a window where you can see out and see all this trash out here doesn't seem like it would logically make sense. And so you would want to maybe like have, like if this were really a restaurant, there would be something like curtains or something there to block the view of the ugly alleyway. So that would be number one. I think number two is that the position of this camera is more or less on eye level or a little bit below eye level. And this isn't, this is a tall door because of this little thing here. So it's not a functioning door, but I think from this angle, I don't know that we would be seeing the roof right there. And also, I can see that there's this wall right here, and it goes back in space, but I don't see an indication of a wall that's going back into space. But I see a back wall, and that back wall isn't on the same perspective grid that the rest of the building is on. You can see that it's right here. And so it's kind of like flush straight to camera, and it has a different perspective than the rest of the building, which would mean that it would be an interior wall that's facing a different direction, which usually on interior buildings, all of the outside walls are the same angles as the inside walls. So I think it introduces enough question to make it not believable enough to pull off. So I would go through and I would replace this with something else. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do with these windows to make them more obscure, and where you're hitting the note, because the note actually is on the shot is to make a light in the window. If you put these in here, it's overstepping the note. It's more than what is required. You just want to have an indication so that there's some kind of light source. So this is an overreaching of that note, but also there's an easier solution to hit that note than to go with the full replacement of that. So if you're going for the note, I would just make sure that you come up with an easier solution where you're not having to replace everything, make them more obscure. But if you are going to put an interior of a room, I would go through and maybe like build a 3D room based on this image here, and get an idea of like where that back wall should be and what we should be seeing and how much of the ceiling, if it's approximately so high and that kind of stuff, to give you a bit of a ballpark of an idea of what you should see. Typically, with matte painting work, if this were like a moving camera through here and we needed to see some parallax between this door and the back in this room right here, then you would actually build interior rooms where and typically they're just a cube, and you would place you would place you know, like images of a room back there, and then you'd actually put a room physically back there, a 3D room, and then you'd have little cards that have like little objects and things in front. You know, like a chair or something like that. So there was parallax of a bunch of different objects in there. You could do the same thing, not because of parallax or anything, but just as an idea, an indication of what this room should look like back there. Because I think that that's not gonna cut it as far as looking like realistic in this spot right here. So overall, if we have a doorway here that's brighter, that has more visual interest, because that's what the client's asking for, I think we're going to have to get rid of that guy because it's going to block the view. And then I would just make sure these have the appropriate shadow and light shapes, and then maybe get rid of this guy, put something else there that's a bit more interesting. All right, so this is Catherine's image, and let's just go through and make some notes here. So I dig the Oriental look on that. I think that's really cool. I think this is a perfect, you know, saying that there's some kind of weird light source in the background. So I buy that. The only thing is, and maybe it's because of the low res of the image, that I would just make sure that this is not too soft of an element. If it's too soft of an element, you can't use it anyways. So I would just make sure the elements that you're putting in here are really soft, are not soft, that are really sharp. So also, I think there's a perspective issue on this one here, where this is kind of flaring out here and this is kind of curving this way here. And so if you look at these perspective lines, we wouldn't see like this big curve on top, I don't think, at this point. So I think that is incorrect. I think this doorway is nice. It may be just a little bit of painterly in there with that cracked window. I dig the cracked window, and I actually like the repetition of this element here and here, and so that makes sense. But I think that painted thing maybe just looks a little bit painterly, so I'd go through and sharpen that up. Also, I think this element here, I think, like, I can tell you've gone through and relit it, but you can see how much of the frame that it takes up. So I think visually, I think that's too intrusive, if that makes sense. So you want to make additions to the plate, but not take over the plate. And so I think what you would have to do is you'd have to move this guy over. And so maybe if it were like right there or something like that, so we could see more of the ground and stuff as we go back, then that would be better. Like if you were working on a show and the note was put some garbage in the alleyway, and then you put this right in the foreground, this would get immediately shot down because it's taking up too much of the frame. So it's kind of a fine line to be able to be like, okay, they made this note. How do I hit this note? How do I make it appropriate? So it's kind of a fine balance, because you want to enhance the image, but you don't want to be doing too much to hit the note. You just want to hit the note, and they'll be most likely be happy with it all. So. And then I guess that would say the same for this. If there's this big object right here, it's a new element, and I think it's probably it obscures the view too much, because there's a lot of really cool things going on in here. And so I did say that there's a perspective problem with this, and I think a scale problem, because I think it would actually be that big. You know, if we're talking the door handles right here. And I know that this is a step up, but you know, if we were to look at it, I think human scale, it's probably would be about this big. So I would X that, because as soon as you fix the scale on it, then it's like taking over your whole image. So move that over, you know, X that out. The lines look good, but yeah. So, but I I guess the things that I'm most excited about is this area here, to have this little step up, and then what you've done with these windows, which I totally dig on that. Yeah, so I think that's working. I see that the splotch marks and stuff that you've done does make it look quite a bit more grimy and things like this. You just want to make sure that if you're adding something like this, that you don't have really soft edges. So like I can see these little things here that look like paint strokes, like really soft paint strokes. And so I don't get the feeling that that paper is curling and eroding and being rained on and stuff like that when it has soft edges like that. So if you do, you'll have to look back and see where this image is coming from. Probably the best source for some image like this is actually to get an image off of a wall that already has that kind of weathering on it and then integrate it, instead of having something that's brand new and then trying to integrate on there. That would be a lot harder to execute on. But overall, I think it's successful, and there's some really good things going on. So this is Jana's work, and I think it's the coloration is looking nice, so you didn't have any problem with that. I dig this tire right here. I think that's a cool thing. I think maybe the scale is just a little bit off. It looks a little bit small, and so I think it would be bigger, something around there. But you would probably want to push it off frame, because what you have there is nice because you can see into the alley. You just get a little indication of the tire. So I think it needs to be scaled up and then pushed back in there. I think there's also a scale issue with this guy here. I think that needs to be addressed. And part of the problem, we saw that on Arkie's work, is that if we made it the appropriate scale, then it would take over. That alleyway. So I think probably Xing it is the better solution for that. It looks like the perspective is working. I totally buy this. It seems like it's hard for me to tell exactly how soft this is. So I would just make sure that you go through and make sure that all of your elements are really, really crisp, and that you're not introducing any kind of softness into your image, because you can always blur sharp things. You just can't make them more sharp. So yeah, I would do that. Also, I think I'm seeing just a little bit of soft, like I would expect just to see some hardness in like these contact shadows. I think these are kind of missing some contact shadows and an indication of some shadows and directional light. It looks like this is being lit from a different direction, maybe that way, because we're getting a lot of brightness on this side. But we should be seeing the light coming in from this way. Well, this way right here, where the light is coming in between the alleyway. So I don't know that this area here, this element, is lit very correctly, but you could just go through and put in some adjustment layers, in here in different places, and just show through, just put in some shadows in these little spots right here. And I think that would all be in shadow. This would have like a shadow shape right there. Maybe we would just see the little bit of light in that corner. So also that we can get a feeling of that there's directional light. On this guy here, I think that there's like the bottom of this and then the bottom of this, like it has a weird perspective there. But then also I guess I can see where it's maybe kind of sliding off, but there's something weird as far as like how these things hit. So I would expect that this bottom of this trash bag would be up higher. But then also I think they would be bigger. So if this is the doorway, then I think our trash bags here would be about this big. I think overall everything is a bit small. I mean, that box right there, that's like a little tiny box. When you compare this little box to like the doorknob or something like that, then you can tell that it's actually really, really small. So overall scale, I think you need to just take a look at and make sure that that's correct. Also, I don't think that the light in these windows is properly executed. I think that if you go through and you actually on the VFX Horde, if there are some in the plates, there are some windows that have light sources behind them, and so and this has this kind of like this kind of shimmery, reflective kind of thing. It looks like a composite of a bunch of different images. And so I would try to find an actual image of a light behind a window instead of trying to create one from scratch. I think you'd have a lot more success out of that. Or take the original of the glass and then just put a little indication, like you're adding on top of it just a little bit. So instead of creating something from scratch, so that would be adding to slightly just to barely hit the note, or to find a window that has something in it already. That way you can pull that off better. But overall, I think the coloration and the door and the steps. I think the best thing probably about this image is how nicely you executed the steps. So I think that's a great job on that. Okay, so now we're looking at Lucas's, and we can see that there is a, this had the same flashed color issue, or you're brightening it after the fact, because it is a pretty dark plate. So, so let's go ahead and take a look. So I can see that there you've replaced this doorway. I think as far as the integration points, it's just a little bit, it's kind of soft through this edge here. And so I think that if you go through your layers in Photoshop and crisp those up and make sure your connection points are looking really good, then that would improve that quite a bit. So the other thing to take a look at is that this perspective kind of slopes down and kind of curves just a little bit. And so you have some nice indication of perspective with all of these lines right here. So I think this should follow that a bit better. So the perspective lines. But the bottom here is looking good as far as the perspective. I buy this right here. There's a bit of a dark spot right here. And so that's a bit of a black hole. And I think the scale of that bag, that looks like a little, like a trash bag that you would have in like a little tiny waste paper basket, where I think the trash bag would actually be, would be something a bit bigger like that. So if you scale that up, then you'll have to take a look at how it fits in that spot now, and you might need to find a different reference. But you kind of like, you see, like I'm not, as far as integration on this particular thing, I would expect to see like a shadow shape going across it. That would be this door falling across it. But I think what you have here is where it just goes into black right there, which I don't think integrates the best right there. Other things, I'm not seeing a light in that window, but and I see the trash here, and I think this is nice. I think the halo light that you have coming in here is probably a bit strong on this element, but I do see a little contact shadow. Probably that contact shadow wouldn't be so fuzzy. It would just be a little bit sharper. If you look in here, there's a contact shadow here of this rock right here, but those are pretty crisp actually. And so I think you could crisp those up just a little bit and make it look nicer. And it's nice to see like you have this shadow going right there on the ground, and it follows like that this box is going up. So I think that's working. But I think you need crisper contact shadows. Also, I think there's an issue with scale. So I think like this box would be a bit more like, maybe like this, if that makes sense. That trash bag would be kind of more like this as far as the scale. So I think everything needs to be scaled up a little bit. And then I think I'm seeing like this guy right here, this top of this box is quite bright. And so I think the lighting direction on that is just a little bit off. You can look at the source photography. That's probably the best indication of where the light source is coming from. So look at the source photography and actually see where the shadows are falling. And then because sometimes on this garbage and overcast lighting, they're complex shapes, it's a bit hard to be able to say, oh, where's that lighting coming from? But really it looks like on this object it's kind of coming from over the shoulder like this, which is not really the right lighting for this. I think this top part needs to be darkened down on that. So, but overall, I think the elements that you're doing, I think, is working good. And like I said, I think this part down here is probably some of the best stuff. Is that integration with the ground and where that doorway comes in. All right, so we're looking at Juarez's work here, and overall, I can see that there has been a manipulation of the plate as far as the color goes. And so then it kind of turns into that you're manipulating the whole image, and it's more of like a concept art piece instead of an actual matte painting. And so, like I said, on other things, you have to be able to, when you're doing a matte painting, to cut and extract these things out. And then this element right here needs to be added to the original plate and needs to integrate with the original plate. You can't like, let's say you wanted it brighter on this side of the alleyway. You couldn't go in there and just put a color correction and make it brighter down there. You would be adding things to it. If you did do that and make it brighter, then it would have to be like a direct note. You say, we want to increase the brightness on this. But then probably a color correction to the plate like that would be done by compositing and not by matte painting. Unless you were adding a bunch of elements in here that you would just do the correction anyways. But then what you would be including is you would still the plate. It means you would grab one frame of the plate and you would replace like this whole section, which would include, your new light in addition to a brighter color corrected element. So that whole thing becomes an element that you deliver to comp. But you can't deliver color corrections to comp because that's comp's area. They're supposed to color correct the plate. So you kind of just stay away from any of that kind of stuff. I do feel like probably what's happened with this is that you brought the image in. It did that weird, brighten thing, and then you cranked it down to get it back to where it was. But what's happening is it's introduced all these artifacts. And so we're seeing a really grainy image because it's been heightened a lot, and then it's been brought back down. So we see those artifacts. I think as far as a look and mood piece, it's kind of nice. But as far as a matte painting, it's a bit hard because it's been manipulated so much to the whole image to say that that you could extract these things as a matte painting. So also, I think there's some of these areas are too black. Something that you want to take care and make sure is that your black levels are correct. So I'm exposing up, and you can see how black that is. That's like a black hole. Once you get that into compositing within Photoshop, it depends on the color workflow that you're working on, but most likely this area here is going to be negative in black values. And so because of the color pipeline, it's going to take certain values in Photoshop that are dark, and it's going to make them like negative black values in Nuke, and that would be bad to do. So you have to go through and do these exposure things just to check and make sure that your values are correct. But as far as like the lighting direction and stuff, it's nice that you have the pool of light and things that you can tell that the light is falling on different things. I think what you need to be careful of is that you don't have like your big soft brush, that you don't just wipe that big soft brush across here as an indication that there's light. Okay. So what I mean by that is that like this side of the box should be dark, because right now this is your primary light source here. So if that's the case, this should be in shadow here. And but what we have is that there's that this and this and this kind of have that like soft brush across it. And so you want to make sure that if you're painting in light, that you're doing it in a way where you're like, okay, this is my light shape, this is my light shape, this is my light shape, and you're making like little masks and things for where the light is hitting, as opposed to just taking a big brush and then just brushing it across there with a lighter value and then saying, hey, that's bright. And I do see that. I do feel that up here and up here and up here. Like there's just a kind of a big wash instead of like actually saying, okay, I'm going to create shadow shapes in here from this light source. So, but overall, yeah. So I would say go back, pull that plate in the correct way so that it doesn't, really whack out your colors. And then you're starting with something a bit better, and then try to stay away from really manipulating the plate. Keep the little areas that you'll be focusing on. And the whole point of this is to take an object and integrate it into the plate and make people think that the elements that you added were always there. So if you change the whole plate, then that kind of blows that just a little bit. So you want to be able to show off from this exercise that you can take something and make it look invisible, like it's like it was always there. Okay, we're taking a look at Maxima's work here. And so I think that, let's see, it looks nice. I think there's maybe just little things here and here. I think maybe that perspective is just a little bit off. Like the base of this box should be up higher because we're seeing it from farther away, right? Because if we are seeing things up close, so if this is our frame here, if there's something that's up close, then we would see big spaces in between things as far as like when they hit the ground. But when they get farther away, those same things should be closer together. And so I think there's some things on this that are hitting too low. So that should all be, if you chopped it right there and you got rid of those things that are hanging too low, then I think that would work out visually better. They could go a little bit below that, but I think that's about the line right there. Also, I think there is also a bit an issue with scale, because I think that's a trash can. If that's a trash can there, then it's pretty small, because we have people walking out of this doorway. They're going to be about that tall. So that comes up maybe to their knee or a little bit lower. So I would expect that trash can to be quite a bit bigger up there. And actually this guy right here would be bigger too, like that. Oh, also, I see this, like, when I looked at this initially, it looks like it was just random trash, but that looks like a mattress. If that's a mattress, that's a really small mattress. And so, so I think, and if this is a piece of furniture, then that's really quite big. So I think this piece right here, you do something to obscure it, but then you're more intrusive in what you're doing. And so, so I think, yeah, I think get rid of that actually. So, I mean, to make it to scale, a mattress would be like this big on it. So if you were to scale up the whole thing, it would be like that big. I think that would make it, it would take up too much of the frame, and I don't know if it has enough resolution to support that. But right now it feels a bit like a miniature. So saying that, I think you should, instead of doing that, I would just replace that image right there. Also, this trash can right here, I think is a bit small. So I think overall, like the lighting of it is feeling nice. Like when I look at the lighting of this area, it's feeling nice. It has a soft directional light and stuff. I'm seeing little contact shadows and shadow shapes and things like that, which I think is really good. So the integration part of it, I think is working. I think the part of it that's not working is the scale of everything. I think you need to increase the scale. But then if you increase the scale, you have to reevaluate whether or not your reference is going to be the right resolution. So that's the thing that you have to do. Also, I like this. I wonder, it's such a maybe the problem that I would have with it is that it's such a saturated color in kind of this shot where there's not a lot of saturation, and it's really coming up across that edge right there. And so maybe try to be a little more subtle with this, so that would, because there's such a really harsh line right there that I'm not, that it draws a lot of attention to itself. So it should be something that's pretty subtle, but I think with the value and the color of it, it makes it kind of like almost like the point of the shot. If you look at the thing that has the most contrast and the most saturation, that would be this area right here. And I don't know that you want to bring people to that area, as the point of the shot. The point of the shot is actually this doorway right here. So if you were to do anything like this, if you were going to make that choice to make something be this strong, then maybe it would be in this, because this is the point of the shot and not this. So I think what you could do is cool this off and de-emphasize it some way. And if you can't do that successfully with the image that you have, then do something else. Maybe the really dim light source is like somewhere over here or something like that, or a little bit up off frame or something like that, instead of being like right there on that side. I think that would help, because if you have the light source here, then I think that kind of helps people get into the image. But if you have this really hard line and it's going here, then it's almost like it's facing this way, which the eye is kind of going this way. So if that makes sense. So I think something has to be done with this guy. Maybe move him to this side. Try that. So, but overall, I think, like I said, the integration is working. It's an issue of scale, and it looks like the perspective is working well on all of this. Like the steps and stuff, I think are executed well, and the perspective is working. Okay, I'm taking a look at Nicky's work. So on this image, I can see you have that brightness problem of the whole shot. So so the whole thing should be darker, but despite that, let's make some comments. I think that there's some perspective issues for this. Like if you look at the perspective here, these are kind of going down, and these are going up like this. But when you look at this wall, you can see that the perspective lines are going like that right there. So you can see from that these should be on the same level. So your steps should be going up here like that. So there's that perspective issue. I actually like this, what you've done here, like having this little like broken pieces and stuff. I think that's quite nice actually. So that's kind of cool. But like the perspective is off on that. And I think the distance between, like, this is a really skinny doorway, but then it doesn't look like it should be because it cuts back so much. And this is the start of the door. So it's like almost like the door should be this big for here. So, and I can understand you're trying to fit the sign in here, so you're like skinnying up the door. But I think if you're gonna cut back on that door, then it has to be wider. Otherwise, you're making the doorway more flush with the wall, and then you're physically making a skinnier doorway to fit in that spot. So, overall, I think that this doorway, I think, needs some work as far as like getting it in there spatially so it fits. Um, Also, like this sign, you can see that like the perspective here is kind of going down this way. So I think that the perspective on that needs to be fixed. Also, neon lights gets a little bit tricky because then you have to pass elements off to comp. And so if you do have a choice to not do neon lights, I would make the choice not to do neon lights because they're a bit difficult. So, even like in that potentially would not even be something that you would be doing. It would be a 3D element because it could be animated or something like that. So that's a little bit iffy as far as that goes. Compositionally, it's the highest saturated, most contrasty area. So if the note is to add a doorway and you put in the sign here, then the shot becomes about the sign and not necessarily about the doorway. And so you kind of have to be careful of that. Also, as far as like painting a light source, I can see that this is your light source here and it's coming down here. There's this big wash of light here. If there was a big wash of light here, I would expect to see more indication of it on the inside of this and inside that window. I think that's where that light would be coming from on the ground and not really from this. I think that would be a bit more localized. So if you're gonna put like a light down here, I think it has to be reflected in that doorway as well. But then also, I think with some of the other people that I've mentioned, like if you're gonna do a light, then you can't have a big brush that's shaped like this and then kind of pass it across this area, because what you actually need to be doing, because your light, you say, hey, I'm going to paint in a light, and so I'm going to make this big color thing right there, and that's going to be my light shape. But really what you have to be doing is putting in more complex light shapes. So this right here would be a light. You get a little bit of a kick on that. This would get hit with light. This would get hit with light. Maybe that edge, but then all of that's in shadow. Something right here. And so all of a sudden, you have a feeling of directionality in your light. When you use that big, soft, fuzzy shape, then it's a bit more of an illustrative, more concept-y kind of a look. But like when you do that, it's gonna, it doesn't say, hey, there's actually a light source. It's more of a light bloom, which is kind of a comp lens effect kind of a thing, which you're not trying to do here. So you have to make it so that there's a lighting direction on that. And I think that goes with everything. I think also your other elements should have a sense of lighting direction from from the sky that's going in between these buildings. And then I would look at scale, because I think actually like these garbage things should be probably up here, like that bag and things like that. This is looking better, but maybe just scaled up just a little bit. Right there. But these look okay right back there as far as that scale goes. I think that looks appropriate. And this probably is a little bit too small. So if it comes out to be there. Yeah. So anyways, and then I would look at the integration of this element here. And it's a little bit hard for me to tell if it's sticking against the wall or if it's hovering away from the wall. If it's hovering away from the wall, then you want to put a shadow shape in there. If it's next to the wall, then you want to put a contact shadow. But I guess the confusing part is that there's these lines right here. And if there's lines right there, and this is a straight shape, then it couldn't go on top of it. So I think it is going out from the wall, but then if it's going out from the wall, then it should have a shadow somewhere. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, great effort on that, and I think a pass of doing directional light shapes and scale and stuff will improve your image pretty quickly. Okay, we're looking at Stefan's here, and immediately I can see that this doorway is integrated really nicely. I like how there's a continuation of the brick across that. That's really nice to see that kind of continuity and to have these steps here. And you can see how little we see on top of that step, which is great, and it looks like it's in the right perspective. I think that, yeah, so I think that's done really well. The garbage throughout here, it's a little bit nondescript, which is okay. But there are certain areas where it starts to look really squashed and small. So I'm looking maybe from like here to here, it's kind of like nondescript garbage, and that's fine. But like when you get out into here, it looks a little bit, well, it looks small. The scale is not correct, because if this is a person here, then you would expect some garbage to be, you know, about that size and stuff. So I think it definitely can get a lot bigger. And when you look at things like this, where this is like really small, it kind of blows the scale. So I think overall the garbage needs to be bigger. And then I'm looking at this light source in here. I think what you've done is you've added a reflection, but but haven't really added a light source in the back. So and I think the light, the reflection, I think if you are going to put reflections in windows, then you need to keep the dark values that are currently in the window, and then just add, like with a screen or something like that, just add the highlight colors. So all of this should be dark like this color. And then you should only see like little bits and pieces of the light color coming through. So that would be a bit more of like a realistic reflection. There is this guy right here is this round shape in here, and it's a pretty strong shape of a reflection in that window. And so I mean, if you're gonna put something like that, I would maybe offset it a little bit, or I'm not sure, because we are, like, from where we are, I don't know that we would be looking up into it as much as we are right now. So I think that the angle of it would be a lot thinner. So I think the angle is wrong, and I think it kind of like draws your eye to it a little bit, where, you know, we don't really want to look at that. So we want to look at your doorway over here. We don't want to look at this light over here. So I would maybe just kill that. And then if you're gonna go with a reflection, make sure you just fill in those dark areas. But yeah, so those changes I think would improve the image. Okay, I'm looking at Torrance's image here, and there's a lot that's been done to this image, and so I think that it's kind of turned from a matte painting into a concept piece. And I've said this before on other people's, but if you're touching every single part of the plate, then it leaves the realm of you as a matte painter adding things to film footage. And so to take this image and then to convert it into like a actual moving footage, you'd be replacing every single thing. Because not only have you added a lot of things, but you've also, which is not really a problem, but adding a lot of things and then doing color corrections on the plate. And the thing is that your stuff that you've added here doesn't really work unless the color corrections are there in Photoshop. So just as an exercise, if you went to your Photoshop file and took off all of the color corrections that's happening to the plate, then would your elements still fit in there? You know, if you had the original plate and then you just had your elements sitting on top, would they integrate? And so that would be a test. You'd probably have to go through and hit them all again. So saying that, I think that the compositionally, I think it's nice. I like how the positioning of the garbage, where it's like right here, right here, right here, right here, kind of bounces your eye back, which is pretty cool. I think there's something that's gone on with your black levels. So this is like really, really dark black levels. And so if I exposed it up here, we would see that, that is like ultra, ultra black right there. And so that's something you have to watch for when you're doing matte paintings, is your black levels, your highlights and your black levels. Because either, so this value here that you have in here would be super brights, which would be like emitting light. And then these would be like in the negative values of darkness here, which both of those in these cases would be inappropriate. I mean, unless you had a matte painted like you were lighting this and this was actually a light source, then that could be over the value of 1, which would be considered a super bright. And that's what you would want. But something that's like just a bright spot here, I don't think would be over the value of 1. Also, okay, so the black levels, the composition, some of these feel like they have a real fuzzy lighting direction or a light source. So I'm looking particularly at this here. It feels like you had a big soft brush that went through and just kind of like brushed the highlights, brushed in the lighting direction. And so, but really, I think that our lighting would be coming in from here. And so we would be getting like, the lighting would be like this. You'd create a mask. So that would be the light side of that object. That would be the light side right there. So you would make little adjustments on your masks so that it looks like there's a lighting direction. And so that's approximately where your lighting would be coming from. And then this would be falling in shadow here. So you would grade the whole thing down, and then you'd put an adjustment layer on top that would brighten these areas, these masks. And they would be specific where you've drawn them so that it has a lighting direction, and you wouldn't use the big brush to kind of like swash through it, because that big brush, it doesn't. It is brightening that area, so it's treating it more like a lens flare or a bloom or something instead of a lighting direction. Okay, and so I see that a little bit with some of these through here, but it's most pronounced right there with that guy. Also, you have to make sure, and we are going from a little bit of a lower res image, but I think I can still see a bit of painterliness up in here, where it just gets a little bit like it's really sharp in here, and then it gets kind of soft and a little bit murky in there. And I can see some of that in here too. Like I would expect to see like hard shadows right there. And so there's little select areas, like there's a little bit of softness down here, a little bit. So you, like I said, this would be a good representation of pre-production concept art, because you don't have to live with the technical restraints of matte painting, but as a matte painter, you have to live under all of these matte painting rules that's going to make it so that you can deliver this for a live action shot. So making that transition from like a concept-y workflow to a production matte painting workflow, you have to approach it a bit differently. So part of that, and I think that's maybe the overall theme for this piece, is that you, like I've said with other ones, if you're going to be replacing something, on the plate, what you would do is you'd have the original plate in the background, and you would get this element to work with that plate. So So you've taken the whole plate and done color corrections and stuff, and then, got all of these elements to work with it. What you would want to do is leave the plate absolutely alone, and then you would integrate your elements into the existing plate. And then you would be able to take this in Photoshop and export that layer and then put it back on top in Nuke without any color corrections. And if you were going to do global color corrections, then the global color corrections that you have like here, like if you're going to do a bloom here and you're going to do maybe some other effects and stuff like that with the light, then that is what you would do in Nuke. And you could work that out and you could suggest it to the compositor. You could deliver that, but then ultimately the compositor is going to rip apart your script probably and redo what you've done the way that they want it to be done. So that's kind of a workflow, workflow issue of how to go about doing this. And so, like I said, I would stay away from like the softiness, the directionality on the light. But as a mood piece, it's working, and as a concept piece. But as a matte painting, I think you have to change your workflow. Okay, we're looking at Stefan's, and we're going to turn that on and off. Looks like, Stefan, you probably had the same color issue that other people had with the EXR. So let's just take a look. So overall, I think it's I like this. What's going on here? That's nice. It has this like really super nondescript lighting source back there. It's kind of frosted. It adds to the piece, but it doesn't take over the shot. So I think that's cool. I think the integration of the splotches is good. I think this stuff down here is good. I think there's a little bit like on this guy here. I think he's missing a little bit of that occlusion shadowing because it is right up against the wall. So I would expect it to have a little bit of dark in there, and then have like a feeling of directionality on the light right there. So we have light coming in between these buildings, and so we have some kind of indication that there's some kind of light source. So this side would probably be just a little bit darker, or this side, depending on how you're going to play the light, if it's coming in from here or from here. So, but this is looking good. And then, and this pile right here is, I think is nice. It fits like it's fitting in perspective there, which is cool. I think that there's a little bit of shadowing, I think, that can probably be put in there that would help it integrate. I would make sure that make a distinction between the lighting shadow that's coming from the lighting and then like a contact shadow. So like this right here, position-wise, if we look at that right there, the position-wise of that, it looks like it's sitting right up against the wall. But the shadowing of it is so broad out here that it makes it look like it's sitting far from the wall. And so it would help if you had a little bit of contact shadow in there to help us feel like it's actually sitting right against the wall. Also, I think this is working here. And then for the perspective on this, I think it's probably working. We're seeing a little bit on top of that step, maybe a little bit too much, but probably we say it's okay because the step is slanting down. So we can blame that on imperfections in the building of the building. So okay. So also, so this guy here, I think that maybe the perspective on this is just a little bit off. It feels just a little bit strange in that spot. Also, I think as far as like a thing to draw your eye to, it's probably like having a seat there is probably a bit too distracting and kind of draws your eye away from the point of the shot, which is this kind of area in here. So this is a pretty demanding, simple shape, and so I think you could not distract from the point of this shot, which is this door here, by creating something a little more complex, something a little more like this. So also, I think that the scale of this is a little bit off. So you think of this as one of those tall trash cans. Typically, those will go up to like the shoulder of somebody, or their you know, right to their armpit or something, as far as the height of some of these trash cans. And so it would almost be up to there. So you'd have to look at this, because this, like the scale of that, looks like it's a bit small. Yeah. This box looks okay. I think that's fine. I think this is small. And then this could probably be a bit bigger too. But overall, you just have to make sure that when you are your technique, like I look at this and it looks a bit painterly. And part of that is it's a little over modeling of it, where like it doesn't, and that's part of the challenge with this sequence, is that it's overcast lighting. And so you get it's pretty hard to have a directionality on the light to make it feel integrated. But something that happens in matte painting sometimes is that they don't like this bag right here has a certain lighting conditions and a certain kind of modeling, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then every single element has a slightly different lighting condition to it, and that makes it feel kind of disjointed. But the way that you would bring all that together is to have that one universal lighting direction that's coming across all of this. And this feels a little bit painterly and a little bit over modeled. So I think that can be softened up. And I would look at how quickly you go into painting, because if you, I would stick with the photos, the raw photos and adjustment layers, and then jump into doing paint work at the very, very end. If you do paint work too early, then it will always make your stuff look really painterly, because and it worked for people when they were painting on glass as matte painters, but now when we have 2K, 4K projections, projectors, and everything is ultra crisp and high detail, we just can't get away with the things that they used to get away with. So we have to stick pretty close to the photography, because the painter work looks a little over modeled. So like some stuff in here, it looks a little bit painterly, and that kind of stuff. So I would, go back to the source photography and see if you can remove your paint layers and then just do adjustment layers on it. Get that like almost all the way in, integrated, and then I would go back through and do like little kicks and highlights and stuff if you feel like it's necessary. If you can't do that with adjustment layers, because you can also do that with adjustment layers too. So anyways, so overall, I think it's a nice image, despite that it's not the right color grade for the plate. So it's hard to say whether or not this is integrated into the plate or not, because you've manipulated the plate. But the composition, the elements, I think, like I said, the scale, this guy is probably too much of an eye catcher. This doorway is looking good. This is looking good. A little bit of directionality on these elements, and I think you'd have a pretty good image. So that wraps up our daily session. Make sure you go over to the VFX Horde and make your pledge to get access to all of sequences, so you can participate in the twice monthly daily sessions that we're going to be holding for the VFX Horde for that special group. So go over there and make your pledge before May 12th so that you can get access to these sequences on May 15th.